Officer Daniel Carter had been working with the police for over 10 years. He was known as a dedicated officer who took his job seriously. His partner was a well-trained K-9 named Rex, a strong and intelligent German shepherd. Rex had been by Carter's side for years, helping track down criminals, find missing people, and protect the community. The two of them had built a strong bond, and Carter trusted Rex completely. One evening, Carter was patrolling a quiet suburban neighborhood when a call came through his radio. There was a report of a disturbance, a loud argument happening outside a house. The caller mentioned that there were raised voices, and someone sounded angry. It wasn't a serious emergency, but as an officer, Carter had to check it out. He turned on his car's lights and headed to the location with Rex in the backseat. When he arrived, he saw a woman standing on the sidewalk, speaking calmly to another man. She wasn't yelling, and there didn't seem to be any physical fight happening. But as a cop, Carter knew things could change in a second. He parked the car, stepped out, and approached the situation with caution. The woman, dressed in casual clothes, turned to look at him. She had a strong, confident posture, the kind that comes from years of discipline. "Officer, there's no problem here," she said in a steady voice. "I was just talking to my brother. Everything is fine." Carter, trained to assess every situation carefully, didn't let his guard down. He had dealt with too many cases where things weren't what they seemed. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said. "I just need to make sure everyone is safe." Rex, trained to respond to his handler's cues, remained inside the vehicle, watching closely. But something happened that no one expected. As Carter reached for his radio to report that he was on the scene, Rex suddenly leaped out of the car. In a split second, the dog charged toward the woman. It was too fast, too sudden. Carter shouted, "Rex, stand down." But the command came too late. The woman, who had been calm just a moment ago, barely had time to react before Rex lunged at her. People screamed. The man she had been talking to tried to intervene, but the powerful dog had already locked onto her. Carter rushed forward, trying to pull Rex back, but the damage was done. The woman collapsed onto the pavement, her body still. The neighborhood, which had been peaceful just moments ago, was now filled with the sounds of sirens, casts, and horror. As Carter knelt beside her, trying to assess the situation, he saw something that made his breath catch. The woman wasn't just any civilian. She was wearing a military tag around her neck. And when backup officers arrived, one of them recognized her immediately. "Oh my God," one officer whispered. "That's General Monique Harris." A sinking feeling hit Carter's stomach. This was no ordinary case, and he had no idea how much worse things were about to get. The quiet neighborhood was no longer peaceful. The street was filled with flashing red and blue lights as more police cars arrived. Officers rushed to the scene, their faces full of shock and confusion. Paramedics pushed through the crowd, working quickly to help the woman on the ground. Some neighbors stood outside their homes, whispering to each other, trying to understand what had just happened. Officer Daniel Carter stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had trained Rex for years, trusted him, and knew he was one of the best police dogs in the department. But tonight, something had gone terribly wrong. He kept replaying the moment in his head, trying to figure out what had triggered Rex. Why had the dog attacked when there was no threat? It made no sense. A senior officer, Lieutenant Brooks, walked up to Carter. His face was serious, his voice firm. "Carter, hand over your badge and gun. You're on administrative leave until further notice." Carter swallowed hard. He had been a cop for years, but this was the first time he had ever been suspended. It was standard procedure after any serious incident, but that didn't make it any easier. He unclipped his badge from his uniform and handed it over. His fingers trembled as he placed his gun in Brooks's hands. Meanwhile, the paramedics worked quickly. The woman, General Monique Harris, was unconscious. They carefully lifted her onto a stretcher and placed her in the ambulance. The sound of the siren echoed through the night as they sped away to the hospital. As the ambulance disappeared down the street, The reality of the situation hit Carter. This wasn't just any person. General Monique Harris was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army. She was a leader, a respected figure, someone who had dedicated her life to serving the country. And now, because of a terrible mistake, she was fighting for her life. News of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, headlines flashed across television screens and social media. Police K-9 attacks U.S. Army general was the top story everywhere. People were outraged. Protests began forming outside the police station, demanding answers. The public wanted to know why an unarmed woman, a decorated military leader, had been attacked by a police dog in her own neighborhood. Carter sat in his apartment, staring at the news coverage. His phone rang constantly, calls from fellow officers, reporters looking for a statement, and even angry strangers leaving threatening messages. But the one call he dreaded the most was coming soon. At that moment, in a quiet office miles away, a man sat at his desk, reading the report about the incident. His hands tightened into fists as he read the name of the victim. His daughter, Harold Harris, a senior FBI officer with decades of experience, had seen many tragedies in his career, but nothing could prepare him for this. His daughter, Monique, the pride of his family, was in the hospital because of a police dog attack. He took a deep breath, picked up his phone, and made a call. "Get me everything on this officer," he said. His voice was calm, but his anger was clear. "I want to know exactly what happened." The case was no longer just about a police dog. It was about justice, and Harold Harris would stop at nothing to get it. Harold Harris sat in his home office, staring at the report in front of him. He had spent decades working as a senior FBI officer, solving some of the most complex cases in the country. But this time, the case was personal. The victim wasn't just another name on a file. It was his daughter, General Monique Harris. He clenched his jaw as he read the details again. A police K-9 had attacked Monique, leaving her in critical condition. The officer in charge, Daniel Carter, had been placed on leave, but that wasn't enough. Harold knew how these cases often played out. Investigations would drag on, excuses would be made, and in the end, justice might never come. He refused to let that happen to his daughter. Without wasting another second, Harold picked up his phone and made a call. "I need everything on Officer Carter and his K-9 unit," he said firmly. "I want to know if there were any past incidents, complaints, or anything that points to negligence." His connections within law enforcement were strong. Within hours, he had access to records that weren't easy for the public to find. What he discovered made his stomach tighten. Rex, the police dog that attacked Monique, had a history. There were reports of aggressive behavior, situations where the dog had acted unpredictably. Complaints had been made by other officers, but those concerns had been ignored. Instead of being taken off duty or retrained, Rex was allowed to continue working. Harold's mind raced. If the police department had ignored warning signs, then Monique's attack wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the result of negligence. Someone had made the decision to keep using a dangerous dog, and now his daughter was paying the price. Meanwhile, Officer Carter sat in his small apartment, his phone buzzing with messages he didn't want to read. He knew the entire country was talking about him. Protesters were outside the police station, demanding his arrest. News anchors were discussing whether he had been careless, whether he had ignored signs that Rex was too aggressive. Carter wanted to defend himself. He wanted to explain that he had trusted Rex, that he had never seen him act this way before. But deep down, doubt was creeping in. Had he missed something? Had there been signs he ignored? As he wrestled with his thoughts, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find two men in suits standing outside. "Officer Carter," one of them said, holding up a badge. "We're with the FBI. We need to ask you some questions." Carter's heart sank. He knew this was coming. Monique Harris wasn't just any victim. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in federal law enforcement. The investigation had just taken a serious turn, And there was no turning back now. Officer Daniel Carter sat across from the FBI agents in a small, dimly lit interrogation room. The air felt heavy, and the silence between questions made his heart pound. He had been in this seat before, but always on the other side, asking questions, not answering them. Now he was the one being investigated. One of the agents, a tall man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Officer Carter, tell us exactly what happened that night," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. Carter took a deep breath. He had already gone over the incident 100 times in his mind, but now, every word he said would be picked apart. "I arrived at the scene after a report of a disturbance. When I got there, I saw two people talking. There was no immediate threat. I was about to report back when Rex suddenly charged out of the car. I tried to stop him, but he hesitated, his throat tightening. It was too late." The second agent, a woman with short hair and a notepad in her hand, raised an eyebrow. "Rex had no command to attack." Carter shook his head. "No, he acted on his own." The agents exchanged a quick glance. They had already been digging into the case, and what they had found was troubling. Rex had been involved in multiple aggressive incidents before, cases where he had shown excessive force or had difficulty following commands. Reports had been filed, but they were buried, never leading to any action. Meanwhile, Harold Harris was conducting his own investigation. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for others to handle the case. He had spent his life uncovering the truth, and now his daughter's life depended on it. Through his FBI contacts, he got access to internal police reports, training records, and past complaints against the K-9 unit. What he found only made him more determined. Several officers had previously raised concerns about Rex's behavior. There were at least 3 documented cases where the dog had acted aggressively without clear reason. In one case, he had lunged at a fellow officer during a training exercise. In another, he had bitten a suspect who was already restrained. But each time, the reports were dismissed as training issues. Harold clenched his fists as he read the files. This wasn't just about his daughter. It was about a system that ignored warnings until it was too late. If someone had taken action earlier, Monique wouldn't be lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. That night, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this case be forgotten or buried under paperwork. He was going to expose the truth, no matter how many people it upset. The next morning, he walked into the FBI headquarters and made a call to one of the top federal prosecutors. "I have evidence of negligence," he said, "and I want a full-scale investigation into the police department's K-9 unit. This cannot be ignored any longer." The battle for justice had begun. The city was no longer quiet. The news of General Monique Harris' attack had spread everywhere. Crowds gathered outside the police station, holding signs and demanding justice. The media covered every detail, and people across the country were asking the same question: how could this have happened? Inside the police department, tension was rising. Officers whispered in hallways, worried about what would come next. The department had handled difficult situations before, but this was different. This time, the victim was not just any person. She was a highly respected U.S. Army general and the daughter of an FBI officer. Harold Harris worked day and night, gathering more evidence. He had already found proof that the police department had ignored warning signs about Rex. But now, he wanted to know why. Who had decided to keep using the dog, even after complaints had been filed? Who had covered up the reports? His investigation led him to a surprising discovery: an internal email from months ago. In it, a police supervisor admitted that Rex had some aggression issues, but insisted that the dog was too valuable to remove from duty. The email mentioned concerns from lower-ranking officers, but the decision had been made to ignore them. Harold's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a case of bad luck. Someone had chosen to take a risk, and now his daughter had paid the price. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Carter was struggling with guilt. He had always believed he was a good cop, someone who followed the rules and did his job with honesty. But now, he was starting to question everything. Had he been blind to the truth about Rex? Had he ignored the warnings because he trusted his partner too much? The FBI investigation was moving fast. Federal agents were questioning officers, digging through files, and uncovering more evidence of a cover-up. The police chief held a press conference, trying to calm the public, but it wasn't enough. People wanted accountability. They wanted justice. Then the whistleblower came forward. A young officer, nervous but determined, stepped up with more information. He revealed that he had personally reported Rex's aggressive behavior months ago. He had sent emails, spoken to supervisors, and even written an official complaint. But instead of taking action, his complaints were ignored. He was even warned to stay quiet if he wanted to keep his job. Harold wasted no time. He took the whistleblower's testimony straight to the federal prosecutor. Now there was clear proof of negligence. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the result of poor decisions, ignored warnings, and a failure of leadership. That evening, the police department made an announcement. Several high-ranking officials were placed on leave. The city's mayor promised a full review of K-9 training policies. And most importantly, Officer Carter was officially charged with negligence and misconduct. The case was no longer just about one police dog. It had become a fight for justice, a fight Harold Harris was determined to win. The city remained on edge as the investigation continued. News stations covered every update, and social media was filled with debates about the case. Some people supported Officer Carter, believing it was just an unfortunate accident. Others demanded justice, saying the police department had ignored too many warnings. In the hospital, General Monique Harris was still fighting for her life. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her, but her injuries were severe. Her family remained by her side, hoping for a miracle. Harold Harris refused to leave her bedside, but even as a father filled with worry, he was also an FBI officer determined to find the truth. Meanwhile, Officer Carter sat alone in his apartment, waiting for his next hearing. His world had completely changed in just a few days. He had been a respected cop with years of experience, and now he was facing serious charges. He felt trapped, unsure of what would happen next. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, his lawyer, Lisa Raymond, stepped inside. She was one of the best defense attorneys in the city, and she had taken Carter's case despite the controversy. "You need to be honest with me," Lisa said, placing a folder on the table. "Did you know Rex had problems?" Carter hesitated before answering. "I trusted him. He was my partner. I never thought he would attack someone without reason." Lisa sighed and opened the folder. Inside were reports from officers who had previously warned about Rex's aggression. "This isn't looking good, Carter. The FBI has proof that the department ignored these warnings. If they can prove you knew about it, you could face serious consequences." Carter ran a hand over his face. "I never wanted this to happen. I never ignored any warning on purpose." Lisa studied him for a moment. "Then we need to prove that. If we can show that the real problem was with the higher-ups, the ones who covered up Rex's history, you might have a chance." At the same time, Harold Harris was meeting with federal prosecutors. He had gathered enough evidence to expose the police department's failure. His next step was clear. He wanted formal charges filed against the officials who had ignored the warnings. "The officers who tried to report Rex were silenced," Harold said firmly. "They were told to keep quiet. That's not just negligence. It's a deliberate cover-up." The prosecutor nodded. "We have enough evidence to take this to court, but the trial will be difficult. The police department will fight back." "I don't care how hard it is," Harold replied. "I'm not stopping until my daughter gets justice." As the case moved forward, the city prepared for a long and difficult legal battle. Protests grew larger, demanding accountability. The police department struggled to defend itself, and some officials resigned before they could be investigated. And in the middle of it all, Monique Harris remained unconscious, unaware that her case had become the turning point in a fight for justice that would change everything. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and citizens filled every seat, waiting for the trial to begin. The case had become one of the most talked about in the country. It wasn't just about a police dog attacking an innocent person. It was about accountability, trust in law enforcement, and a system that had ignored warning signs for too long. Officer Daniel Carter sat at the defense table, his hands clenched together. He had spent years enforcing the law, but now he was the one on trial. His lawyer, Lisa Raymond, sat beside him, flipping through files and preparing for the intense questioning ahead. Across the room, Harold Harris sat with his legal team, his face calm but his eyes filled with determination. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case. They showed reports proving that multiple officers had raised concerns about Rex's aggressive behavior. They played recordings of interviews with officers who had tried to report the issues but were ignored. And most importantly, they revealed an internal email where a supervisor admitted that Rex was a risk but was kept on duty anyway. This was not an accident, the prosecutor said firmly. This was the result of negligence. Officer Carter may not have made the final decision, but he was part of a system that ignored warning signs, and because of that, an innocent woman was nearly killed. Lisa Raymond stood up to defend Carter. "My client is not responsible for the decisions made by his superiors," she argued. "He trusted his partner, as any officer would. He was not aware of the suppressed reports, and he did not give the command to attack." Harold Harris listened carefully, his hands tightening into fists. He wasn't just here as an FBI officer. He was here as a father. He wanted justice for his daughter, but he also wanted the truth. And the truth was becoming clear. The real problem wasn't just one officer. It was a department that had ignored danger signs for too long. Then the whistleblower took the stand. The young officer who had reported Rex's behavior months ago spoke in a steady voice. "I sent reports, I spoke to my superiors, and I was told to keep quiet. If my warnings had been taken seriously, General Harris wouldn't be in a hospital right now." The courtroom was silent. The weight of his words was undeniable. As the trial continued, new evidence came to light. More officers came forward, revealing that complaints about Rex had been ignored for years. The focus of the case started shifting, from Officer Carter to the leaders who had covered up the truth. Outside the courtroom, the protests grew louder. People demanded change. The city's mayor held a press conference, promising a full review of police policies. And in the hospital, Monique Harris's condition remained unchanged. Harold Harris sat in his car after the trial session, staring out the window. He had spent his life seeking justice for others. Now he was fighting for his own daughter. And he wasn't going to stop until the people responsible were held accountable. The final day of the trial had arrived. The entire city was watching, waiting to see what the verdict would be. News channels covered every moment, and social media was flooded with discussions. Would Officer Carter be found guilty? Would the police department be held accountable? Or would this case end like so many others, with no real justice? Inside the courtroom, tension filled the air. Harold Harris sat in the front row, his hands folded tightly. His daughter, General Monique Harris, was still in the hospital, unconscious. He had fought for justice his entire life, but this time it was personal. He wanted answers. He wanted change. And most of all, he wanted his daughter to wake up and see that her suffering had not been ignored. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The jury had reached a decision. The foreman stood up, holding a piece of paper with the verdict. In the case of Officer Daniel Carter, the jury finds the defendant not guilty of intentional harm, but guilty of negligence. A wave of mixed reactions spread through the room. Some gasped, some sighed, and others shook their heads. Officer Carter closed his eyes, relief and regret battling inside him. He would not face jail time, but his career in law enforcement was over. The judge sentenced him to probation, community service, and mandatory retraining on handling K-9 units. But the trial was not over yet. The prosecution then turned its focus to the police department officials who had ignored the warnings about wrecks. One by one, supervisors and higher-ups were called forward. The evidence against them was strong. Emails, reports, and witness testimonies all proved that they had chosen to keep using an aggressive dog, despite the risks. By the end of the trial, several high-ranking officers were officially charged with misconduct. The police department was ordered to review its policies, retrain all K-9 units, and put stronger safety measures in place. It was a small step, but it was a start. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, waiting for Harold Harris to speak. He stepped up to the microphones, his voice calm but firm. "This case was never about revenge," he said. "It was about responsibility. My daughter dedicated her life to protecting this country, and she was nearly killed because people in power ignored warning signs. That cannot happen again." The crowd cheered, but Harold knew the fight wasn't over. Policy changes were being made, but true justice would only come when Monique woke up and saw the impact her case had made. That evening, Harold returned to the hospital, sitting beside his daughter's bed as he had done every night. He held her hand, hoping for any sign of movement. Then, just as he was about to leave, he felt the slightest squeeze. His breath caught in his throat. "Monique," he whispered. Her fingers moved again. Tears filled his eyes. After weeks of uncertainty, hope had finally returned.